On the northern plains in the winter of 1886 to 87, signal service stations logged repeated cold waves dropping toward -40 degrees Fahrenheit, with weeks where the thermometer never rose above freezing, and stock losses on open range reached tens of thousands of head. Freight wagons stalled, rail spurs froze. Out on the prairie, ranchers counted carcasses and hay bales. In town, one man counted barrels and matchboxes. In a small rail-end settlement, the general store ledger showed a simple mismatch. The number of families in town was nearly unchanged. Winter nights were the same length as the year before, but coal oil orders had climbed by half in just a few seasons. Barrels emptied faster, matchboxes sold in stacks. Household accounts carried ever larger lines for oil and lamps, even as people insisted they only burned a lamp or two in the evening. The ledgers said otherwise. When the next freight delay hit, that arithmetic would decide how many homes kept a light burning to the end of winter. 10th of November, 1886. A small rail-end town on a Dakota Territory branch line. Frost rhymed the iron hoops of 3 coal oil barrels stacked behind the general store. Each hoop carried a faint line of leaked oil, frozen into the packed dirt where the barrels had been rolled off the freight platform. The barrels themselves stood upright against the back wall, their bungs sealed with wooden plugs wrapped in oiled cloth. On paper, kerosene was the cheap modern light. Refineries in Pennsylvania and Ohio produced it by the tens of thousands of barrels each month. It had replaced tallow candles and whale oil across most of the settled states. It was supposed to be affordable, abundant, democratic light, the fuel that let ordinary families read and work after dark without the expense of wax or the mess of grease. At the frontier railhead, the story was different. The storekeeper received his barrels off the freight car once every 4 to 6 weeks, depending on weather and track conditions. Each barrel held approximately 50 gallons when full and weighed over 400 pounds. Moving them required a hand truck, a strong back, and careful balance. Once inside the cramped back room, he used a marked dipstick to check each barrel's actual volume. Leakage was common. Staves shrank in cold, expanded in heat. A barrel shipped full from the warehouse might arrive 3 gallons short. He transferred coal oil to customers using a brass funnel and their own jugs. Most households brought gallon or 2-gallon stoneware containers. He recorded each sale in his daybook. Customer name, quantity, price. Most purchases went on credit to be settled after harvest or when a husband returned from seasonal work on the railroad section crews. The cost stack was straightforward. The refinery sold kerosene for approximately 26 cents per gallon by the mid-1870s. Rail freight added another cost per 100 pounds shipped. Wagon haul from the main line to branch depots added more. The storekeeper's margin, covering his building, labor, spoilage, and credit risk, pushed the final counter price to somewhere between 35 and 50 cents per gallon, depending on season and competition. In his ledger, coal oil sat beside flour, harness leather, and nails as a recurring winter expense. Every gallon passed through this back room. Every customer's name appeared on these pages. The store was already functioning as an energy meter for the entire town, even though nobody thought of it that way. By late autumn of 1886, one pattern was clear. Coal oil entries were rising faster than the number of names in the ledger. Population was stable. Building count had barely changed. But fuel consumption was climbing, roughly 50% higher per household over just 3 seasons. The storekeeper didn't yet know why. He only knew the barrels emptied faster each winter, and reorders came more often. Somewhere between the refinery and the lamp wick, something had changed. 30th of December, 1886. The same town and surrounding ranch country, 20 to 60 miles out. Inside a plank-sided farmhouse, frost feathers laced the lower panes of the single window. Above them, the lamp chimney was filmed dark, from running the wick high through long evenings. Outside, snow lay in unbroken drifts across the fields. Cattle had drifted with the wind, then piled against fences and coulees. Some were dead. Most were weak. The winter of 1886 to 87 ran longer and colder than living memory. Signal service stations across Dakota Territory and Montana logged day after day of sub-zero temperatures. In some locations, the thermometer dropped below -30 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for a week. Minima of -40 were recorded at multiple stations. Weeks passed where daytime highs never reached freezing. Snow fell in repeated storms. Drifts built to 15 and 20 feet in cuts and coulees. This was the winter that would later be called the Great Die-Up. Open-range cattle operations lost 50 to 90% of their herds. Animals froze standing up or suffocated in drifts. Hay ran out. Feed couldn't be hauled. Ranchers who had counted wealth in thousands of head found themselves ruined by spring. For homesteaders and townsfolk, the winter meant something different but equally grinding. More hours indoors, more time confined to 1 or 2 heated rooms, more evenings spent on tasks that required steady light, mending harness, sewing clothing, reading, handwork of every kind. Line cabins on cattle outfits burned lanterns for night checks in whiteouts. Ranch bunkhouses kept lamps going until late, while men repaired gear they couldn't fix outdoors. Town households extended their lamplight hours simply because there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to go. The typical evening light. Window in midwinter ran from about 4:30 in the afternoon to 10 o'clock at night, 5.5 hours. In normal winters, families might burn 1 or 2 lamps for part of that time. In this winter, lamps burned longer and more consistently. Storm days pushed daytime use as well, when interiors stayed dim even at noon. Rail crews fought drifts and frozen switches. Freight schedules fell apart. Distances that normally took 2 days by wagon stretched to 4 or 5, or became impassable. Coal oil shipments, like everything else, arrived late or not at all. By late December, the store's daybook showed coal oil sales already exceeding the previous year's entire midwinter. Yet, when customers came to settle their accounts or request more credit, they offered the same explanation. "We only burn a lamp or 2 in the evening, same as always." The ledger said otherwise. More nights indoors, more tasks pushed into evening light, and more storm days combined to drive lamp hours sharply upward. Nobody had built more rooms. Nobody had added more residents. The increase came entirely from use, overlapping lamps, longer burns, and habits nobody was tracking. A regional newspaper noted the record snow and unprecedented cold. Ranchers began counting losses. In town, the storekeeper was counting something else: barrels, matches, and the widening gap between what people believed they burned and what the numbers showed. 10th of January, 1887. Back room of the general store, same town. A marked dipstick lay across the open bung of a coal oil barrel. Pencil lines showed last month's levels, each lower than the year before, on the same date. The storekeeper had begun tracking depletion more carefully, measuring every few days and noting the results in the margin of his daybook. The numbers told a story most customers didn't see. People remembered lamps and evenings in vague terms. "We light 1 after supper, maybe 2 if someone's sewing." The ledger didn't track memories. It tracked gallons, matches, chimneys, and the names attached to each purchase. The storekeeper reread his own entries. Coal oil by the gallon or jug. Matches by the box, each box holding roughly 100 friction sticks. Lamp chimneys and burners by the piece, sold as replacements when glass cracked or metal corroded. All on running credit lines to be reconciled later. He pulled account books from similar prairie communities, used as comparison. Those ledgers showed the same pattern. Coal oil and matches appearing weekly, sometimes more often, in household accounts. The frequency suggested something beyond 1 or 2 lamps in the evening. The arithmetic was straightforward if you worked through it. A typical flat-wick kerosene lamp or lantern, depending on burner size and flame height, consumed somewhere between 5 and 40 milliliters of oil per hour. Most household lamps fell in the middle of that range, burning roughly 15 to 25 milliliters per hour at moderate wick settings. A gallon of kerosene equaled approximately 3,780 milliliters. 1 gallon, burned steadily in a single lamp, might provide 150 to 200 hours of light. Match sales told another part of the story. If a household bought 3 boxes of matches in a month, 300 total sticks, and each match lit a lamp or candle that burned for even an hour, that implied 300 lamp hours. Divide that by 30 days, and the household was burning 10 lamp hours per day on average. That was more than 1 or 2 lamps in the evening. It suggested overlapping lamps, short burns in different rooms, and relighting throughout the day. The storekeeper didn't need complex calculations. He just needed to watch the barrels. They emptied faster than population growth could explain. Matchboxes sold in stacks. Replacement chimneys moved steadily off the shelf. Simple arithmetic, barrels in, gallons out, matches per name, revealed a system nobody had actually looked at. Overlapping lamps and short, casual burns were pushing total fuel consumption far beyond what anyone admitted or even noticed. The question forming in the storekeeper's mind was practical and urgent. If the town could already count every barrel and every match, could it use that existing data to change behavior enough to cut fuel burn by a third or more without losing usable light? That question would drive everything that followed. 15th of January, 1887. General store floor and a typical 2-room claim shack nearby. A single table lamp was moved from the front counter to the store's center ledger table. The storekeeper turned the wick down until the flames stopped smoking and the chimney cleared. The lamp cast a steady circle of light across the table surface, enough to read ledger entries, count coins, and wrap parcels. The common belief was simple. More lamps meant more comfort, more safety, more light. Technical reality was different. A single well-placed lamp with a reflector provided most of the useful task light in a small room. Additional lamps mostly lit walls, rafters, and empty corners, spaces where no work was being done. The store's interior was typical of frontier commercial buildings: narrow center aisle, side shelving, overhead beams. During evening hours, the storekeeper had been running 3 small lamps, one near the door, one at the counter, one in the back. Each lamp burned independently. Total fuel draw was roughly triple that of a single lamp. He conducted a simple test. For 1 week, he used only the center lamp, positioned on the main counter with a polished tin reflector behind it. The reflector was nothing elaborate, just a curved sheet of bright metal that bounced light forward onto the work surface. This effectively doubled the useful illumination on the counter without changing fuel consumption at all. Customers noticed no difference. The door was still visible. The counter was well lit. The shelves were adequately illuminated for finding goods. What had changed was invisible. Fuel draw had dropped by roughly 2/3. Inside a homestead cabin, the logic was the same. Main room with table, stove, and bunks. Secondary sleeping or pantry alcove. Most families lit 1 lamp in the main room and another in the alcove or near the stove. Both burned simultaneously for hours. Documented lamp performance showed that a single 14-linear circular burner consumed approximately 40 grams, about 53 milliliters, of lamp oil per hour. Only about 1/4% of that energy emerged as visible light. The rest became heat. At what distance from a lamp could 8 to 10-point print be comfortably read? Tests showed that a well-trimmed lamp with a reflector allowed reading at 6 to 8 feet. Beyond that, light fell off sharply. But within that radius, 1 lamp did the work. In a 12 by 16-foot room, one disciplined lamp could provide 80 to 90% of the useful light that 3 uncontrolled lamps delivered, at roughly one-third the fuel. The problem wasn't lamp technology, the problem was placement, discipline, and counting. 20th through 31st of January, 1887. General store, same town. A scrap of board by the storeroom door carried 4 neat columns in chalk: day, matches, barrel inches, notes. The storekeeper set up his own controlled trial. Same opening and closing times, same customer traffic, 1 main lamp at a time in the sales room. Strictly counted ignitions. Baseline week first. He tallied every match struck to light a lamp. He measured starting and ending barrel levels with the dipstick at the same hour each day. He recorded total hours the store remained open. The results: 3 lamps running most evenings. Matches struck freely, relighting wicks that had been turned low, lighting a second lamp to check stock in the back room, striking new matches rather than carrying a lit lamp from one area to another. Daily oil draw was measurable and consistent. Intervention week followed. 1 lamp to start, 1 lamp to close. Any additional lighting required justification and was noted. The rule was enforced strictly. If someone needed to check the back room, they carried the main lamp with them. If the lamp needed to be moved, it was moved, not duplicated. The depot telegrapher, occasionally in the store after dark, noticed no real change in how well he could read freight notices on the wall. The store felt the same. Work proceeded normally. But the tally board told a different story. Match counts fell sharply. Daily oil draw, measured in inches of barrel depletion, dropped by a measurable fraction, while hours open remained constant. Over 2 weeks, the same store, selling the same goods to the same people in the same building, burned several gallons less coal oil solely by refusing to light more than 1 lamp at a time. The principle was clear. In a confined, high-use interior, counting ignitions and avoiding overlapping lamps immediately slowed the rate of oil loss without dimming the counter or reducing functionality. Documented lamp consumption ranges supported the finding. Reducing from 3 lamps in use to 1 central lamp, properly placed with a reflector, could cut fuel use by 30 to 40% in that space. The storekeeper wrote the results in the margin of his daybook. 1 lamp rule, 14 days, saved 4 gal versus prior practice. The experiment proved something important. Fuel waste wasn't a mystery. It was measurable, controllable, and fixable with nothing more than attention and discipline. 1st through 20th of February, 1887. Homesteads 5 to 15 miles from town. On the rough door jamb of a sod house, a strip of paper was tacked at eye level. Short pencil strokes in neat rows marked each time a match was struck. 1 mark per ignition. No exceptions. Most families believed they were already careful with fuel. They bought coal oil in small jugs, not barrels. They disliked refilling lamps during storms. They considered themselves frugal simply by necessity. Once they actually counted ignitions and tracked jug levels, many discovered something surprising. Overlapping lamps and short, habitual burns consumed a far larger share of their winter supply than anyone had realized. Homestead cabins typically had 1 to 3 rooms. Most families owned 2 main lamps and 1 barn lantern. The usual pattern: light 1 lamp in the main room at dusk, light a second if someone moved to the side room or alcove. Both lamps might burn until bedtime. The barn lantern burned during evening chores. The household rule set, translated from the store test, was simple. 1 primary lamp lit at dusk in the main room. No second indoor flame lit in that household until the first was extinguished or moved. Every match strike earned a tally on the door card for 30 days. The physical realities shaped the practice. Carrying a lit lamp between rooms became routine. Common placement evolved: central table, near the stove, by the workbench. Families adjusted. Tasks that required close light happened near the lamp. Activities that didn't, like tending the stove or moving between rooms, happened without additional light. Using measured lamp rates, the savings were predictable. A 3-lamp household operating as a 1-lamp household most evenings could cut total fuel consumption by roughly 50 to 60% without reducing the total hours of available light. The difference was elimination of overlapping, redundant flames. Counting matches exposed exactly how often someone lit just a quick lamp in a side room or relit a wick that had been left low instead of properly extinguished. These small, invisible habits, invisible until counted, were driving disproportionate fuel use. By month's end, the results were visible. 2. Similar households started February with similar supplies. One tracked matches and followed the single-lamp rule. The other continued prior habits. By the end of the month, the counting household had days more lamp hours remaining in its jug. Rural memoirs and local histories confirmed that many farmhouses relied on 1 or 2 kerosene lamps for nearly all after-dark work well into the 20th century. The practice wasn't new. What was new was making it deliberate, measurable, and shared. 20th of February through 5th of March, 1887. Same town and service area during a documented spell of rail disruption. A handwritten notice at the depot stated that trains east of the division point were snowbound. Coal and freight were expected when tracks are cleared. No date given, no estimate. The assumption had always been that coal, oil, and groceries would arrive on their usual schedule. Shortages were rare. The railroad ran most of the time. Towns might wait an extra week in bad weather, but supplies came through. A single 2-week break in freight turned the difference between careful and casual lamp use into the difference between margin and shortage. Rail dispatch and newspaper reports documented blocked cuts and stalled trains throughout the winter of 1886 to 87. Drifts buried tracks to depths of 15 and 20 feet. Locomotives sent to clear the line became stuck themselves. Section crews worked around the clock in sub-zero conditions. Some stretches remained impassable for weeks. For households 3 or 4 weeks into counting matches and managing lamps, the delay was inconvenient but survivable. Their storage cans were still substantially full. They had built margin into their supply simply by eliminating waste. For households continuing prior habits, multiple overlapping lamps, uncounted ignitions, the delay was a crisis. They arrived at the freight gap already low on fuel. An extra week or 2 without resupply meant running out entirely. The arithmetic was straightforward. Estimate normal delivery interval, perhaps 4 to 6 weeks between coal oil shipments for a small town. A 2-week delay stretched that to 6 to 8 weeks. Build a scenario table comparing 2 patterns. High-use pattern, multiple lamps, no counting. Baseline burn rate of roughly 5 gallons per month for a typical household. Low-use pattern, single lamp, counted ignitions. Burn rate reduced to approximately 2 to 3 gallons per month. Both households start with the same supply, say 8 gallons at the beginning of the gap. Translate lamp consumption rates into days of light remaining under both patterns. High-use household, 8 gallons at 5 gallons per month equals roughly 48 days of supply. Freight delayed 2 extra weeks means they run out before resupply. Low-use household, 8 gallons at 2.5 gallons per month equals roughly 96 days. They ride out the delay with weeks to spare. The counting protocol effectively built a buffer into each household's fuel stock. In disruption, this buffer was the only difference between keeping the main room lit and resorting to leftover candles or firelight alone. Under the same storm, with the same original supply, single-lamp households might ride out an extra week or more of delay. Multi-lamp households hit empty days earlier. Nebraska and Dakota Historical Society records documented blizzard-induced rail and stage delays, with contemporary accounts of towns running short on coal, grain, and provisions. The delay passed. Freight resumed. But the lesson was clear. Resilience came from using less, not from hoping for more. March 1887. Main Street interiors, church, school, livery barn, and the store. In the church loft, a coal oil chandelier hung over empty pews. During evening services, only every other burner was filled and lit. The fixture had been designed with 6 burners. Now it operated with 3. The aisle remained adequately lit. The podium was clear. No one complained about darkness. Public spaces were assumed to need many lamps, for respectability, for safety, for the appearance of prosperity and civilization. Applying the same single flame and counting logic to these buildings sharply reduced their share of town-wide fuel use without leaving aisles or workspaces dangerously dark. Church trustees and school board members reviewed coal oil bills from the past winter against shrinking donations and tax receipts. Public buildings consumed fuel from communal funds, church offerings, school levies, civic budgets. When those funds tightened, every gallon mattered. The logic was the same as in households. Multi-burner fixtures allowed selective operation, which burners could be left empty or unlit while still providing adequate light over key areas: the pulpit, the teacher's desk, the aisle. Most fixtures had more capacity than necessary. Running at half capacity still delivered sufficient illumination. Stable and livery operators were already accustomed to minimizing barn lantern burns for both economy and safety. Too many open flames near hay and straw invited disaster. The typical pattern: one lantern at the barn entry, another only for specific tasks like examining a lame horse or repairing tack. This already approximated one flame at a time. Quantify the effect. A chandelier with 6 burners, each consuming approximately the same fuel per hour as a household lamp, operating 2 nights per week over a 20-week winter season. 40 total lighting sessions. At 6 burners, total consumption might reach 15 to 20 gallons for the season. At 3 burners, consumption drops to 7 to 10 gallons. The savings, 8 to 10 gallons, was significant for a community budget. Period photographs and descriptions of churches and community halls showed coal oil fixtures prominently. Town or church records from similar communities listed purchases of coal oil, wicks, and chimneys among regular expenses. Once public buildings joined households in reducing overlapping lamps, the town's aggregate coal oil orders flattened despite ongoing harsh winter conditions. The paradox stood clear. In the hardest winter on record, with more indoor hours and more extreme cold than anyone had experienced, total lamp oil purchases stopped rising for the first time in years. The numbers had shifted. Behavior had changed. What had seemed like an inevitable rising cost, lamplight in winter, turned out to be compressible, manageable, and controllable through nothing more than discipline and counting. July 1887. Back of the general store, comparing the last 2 winters. 2 facing ledger pages, both titled Winter Coal Oil, one for 1885 to 86, one for 1886 to 87, showed different barrel counts and totals. The assumption had always been that a harsh winter cost more in fuel. Colder temperatures meant more time indoors. Longer nights meant more lamp hours. Severe conditions should drive consumption upward. The winter of 1886 to 87 was tied directly to the Great Die-Up. Signal Service records confirmed it as one of the coldest, longest, most brutal winters in territorial history. Stock losses reached catastrophic levels. Ranchers lost herds. Homesteaders endured weeks of sub-zero cold. Indoor hours were higher than any prior season. Yet coal oil usage was flat or even lower once counting and single lamp practice were in place. The storekeeper totaled the figures. Winter of 1885 to 86. 12 barrels received, approximately 600 gallons sold for roughly the same number of households. Winter of 1886 to 87. 7 to 8 barrels, approximately 350 to 400 gallons for the same population. Ranch and homestead records showed the same contradiction. The same account books that documented catastrophic livestock losses and emergency feed purchases now sat alongside surprisingly stable lamp oil lines. The arithmetic was clear. Dropping from 12 barrels to 7 barrels for a similar number of households represented a reduction of roughly 40 to 45%. Convert gallons into approximate lamp hours, given measured per hour burn rates. The total hours of light did not fall by half. Only overlapping lamps had been eliminated. Documented kerosene lamp efficiencies and rural fuel use studies supported the plausibility of 30 to 50% savings from behavioral change alone. No new hardware, no different fuel, just disciplined use. The match ledger regime, single lamp, counted ignitions, translated directly into a smaller number of barrels ordered over a full season, even under worse weather. The key number landed here. With no change in fuel type or lamp hardware, the town had plausibly cut its kerosene burn by on, the order of a third to a half. The winter that should have doubled the bill instead revealed how much had been wasted in ordinary years. Scarcity forced visibility. Visibility enabled control. Control delivered savings that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. September 1887. Seasonal lamp cleaning and repair across town. On a bench behind the store, a short row of intact chimneys dried in weak sun. A smaller crate of broken ones sat to the side. The storekeeper was preparing to place his autumn order for replacement stock. The numbers surprised him. The assumption had been that cutting lamps might risk darker rooms, more eye strain, and accidents. The outcome was different. Fewer burning hours and more attention per lamp improved light quality, extended chimney life, and likely reduced minor injuries and fires. Store inventory comparison. How many chimneys, wicks, and burners had been sold for replacement over the past winter versus prior winters? The count was markedly lower. The relationship between wick height, flame shape, and soot production was well understood in period manuals. Tall, flickering flames wasted fuel and darkened chimneys faster. Moderate, steady flames produced less soot, required less frequent cleaning, and put less thermal stress on glass. Fewer simultaneous lamps meant fewer glass bodies cycling rapidly between cold and hot. Thermal shock was a leading cause of chimney breakage. A lamp lit once and burned steadily for several hours experienced less stress than a lamp repeatedly lit, extinguished, moved, and relit. Trimming and cleaning guidance from period sources advised washing chimneys weekly and keeping wicks trimmed to prevent smoking. Under a match ledger regime, each lamp was treated as a primary tool, maintained well, burned steadily, and monitored closely. This reduced both maintenance costs and risk. Rural advice pieces and safety notices warned about overfilled lamps, smoking chimneys, and the fire risk of poorly maintained burners. Fewer burning lamps, each well maintained, meant fewer opportunities for accidents. The storekeeper compiled a combined tally for the season. Fewer barrels ordered, fewer replacement chimneys sold. Yet households reported clearer, more readable light, concentrated where work was actually being done. The secondary benefits, lower maintenance, reduced breakage, better light quality, were unintended but real. They reinforced the primary savings and made the new practice easier to sustain. The lesson extended beyond fuel alone. Discipline in one area improved outcomes across the system. Waste cut in lamplight meant money saved for other necessities. Glass unbroken meant fewer trips to town in harsh weather. Light concentrated where needed meant tasks completed more efficiently. January 1888. Same region, another severe cold spell, and transport disruption. At the depot, another delay notice was posted. Trains were blocked again by drifts and cold. Freight would arrive when conditions permit. The wording was identical to the previous year's notices. But there was no scramble at the store for the last jug of coal oil. No panic, no emergency rationing discussions. The assumption had been that a second harsh winter would bring the same fear of running dry. With lower baseline consumption and counting as habit, the same level of disruption now fit inside the town's normal margin. The depot telegrapher sent and receiving news of blocked lines. His own lamp usage had been shaped by the previous winter's lessons. He operated his office lamp with the same discipline he'd observed at the store, one flame at a time, properly trimmed, carefully counted. Households checked their dipsticks and tally cards. Most found more days of light in reserve at normal practice than they'd had at this point the previous winter, despite similar usage patterns. Recalculate days of light at current burn rates. A household burning 2.5 gallons per month with 8 gallons in storage had roughly 96 days of supply. Even if freight delays stretched to 3 weeks, they remained well within margin. If a similar freight gap occurred, and it did, many homes maintained their usual evening pattern without rationing. The buffer built by elimination of overlapping lamps was sufficient to absorb normal supply chain disruptions. Ongoing regional weather summaries and accounts documented continuing severe winters following the Great Die-Up. The climate pattern had not eased. Cold persisted. Storms continued. Rail delays remained common. What had changed was not the weather or the infrastructure. What had changed was the baseline consumption rate and the margin built into every household's fuel stock through disciplined use. The method had shifted from emergency experiment to normal practice. Resilience to supply shocks was now baked into ordinary behavior. Families counted matches as routinely as they counted eggs or measured flour. The town experienced the same kind of winter weather that once threatened to extinguish its lamplight. But it rode through without shortages, without fear, and without fundamental disruption to evening routines. The turning point was clear. Scarcity had taught visibility. Visibility had enabled control. Control had become resilience. 1888 through 1895. Across the northern plains and interior west, a farm account book from another township showed coal oil entries shrinking year by year. On the same pages, new entries appeared: storm windows, improved door seals, heavier winter clothing. The household was investing savings from reduced fuel use into other improvements that further increased winter comfort. The assumption had been that frontier efficiency came mainly from new hardware, better stoves, improved lamps, bigger barrels. Many of the real gains came from a quieter tool, counting, and from simple operational rules applied to existing gear. Other rail-end towns and farmsteads adopted similar practices. Kerosene stoves began replacing some stovetop wood heating in kitchens, offering more precise temperature control. Better cabin insulation and draft control appeared in harsh winter belts. But these hardware improvements often followed and were funded by the savings from better lamp discipline. Farmers extended the same counting habit to other scarce resources. Wood piles were measured in cords, tallied weekly. Coal sheds tracked consumption per degree day. Feed stacks were inventoried by the bale. The principle was universal: measure what you use, set targets, track results. The match ledger mindset paralleled careful cord counting, improved chinking, and storm window use. Each was a way of stretching scarce energy across long winters. Seasonal planning shifted from guesswork to known burn rates and documented past consumption. Agricultural bulletins and farm management manuals began explicitly treating fuel and light as quantities to be measured and budgeted. The language of household economy absorbed the lessons of the hard winters. Settlements that integrated counting into daily practice were more likely to hold through severe weather cycles and commodity swings. Those that didn't often left more abandoned claims and shuttered storefronts behind when the next crisis arrived. The pattern showed up on survival maps. Towns with better paper trails of consumption, detailed store ledgers, careful household accounts, documented fuel purchases lined up closely with those that endured and eventually prospered. Counting was not romantic. It was not heroic. It did not make good stories around campfires or inspire ballads. But it worked. It turned invisible waste into visible savings. It converted crisis into routine. It gave people agency over resources they had always assumed were beyond control. The ledger was as much a survival tool as the axe or the plow. 20th and 21st century, archives and museum collections. In an archives reading room, a researcher turns pages of a cracked daybook. On one line, written in brown ink that has faded but remains legible, coal oil, 1 gal. Matches, 1 box. The assumption is that energy history in the West is about high-profile infrastructure, coal mines, hydroelectric dams, pipelines, and power grids. For most settlers, it was about whether one more lamp burned in a 3-room house on a January night. Archivists and historians handle these ledgers carefully. Store daybooks, farm notebooks, photographs of dim interiors lit by single lamps and lanterns. The documents are fragile. The information they contain is precise. Modern off-grid homesteaders apply almost identical math to diesel generators, propane tanks, solar battery storage, and LED fixtures. The technology changes. The arithmetic doesn't. Typical lamp consumption per hour, 15 to 25 milliliters for a flat-wick burner at moderate. Settings. Approximate barrels per winter before counting, 10 to 12 for a small town's households. After disciplined use, 6 to 8 barrels. Savings range, 30 to 50% from elimination of overlapping lamps and counted ignitions. The explicit link from 19th century coal oil thrift to contemporary energy budgeting is direct and unbroken. The constraint shifts: kerosene, electricity, diesel, propane, but the solution remains: measure, count, adjust. Specific artifacts anchor the story: a tall kerosene lamp with a soot-stained chimney preserved in a rural museum, a door jamb with tally marks saved when an old homestead was dismantled, a ledger that lists coal oil and matches month after month for decades. The match ledger idea isn't a curiosity. It's a small, precise example of how frontier people turned simple records into survival tools. It demonstrates that understanding and adjusting behavior around a scarce resource can be as powerful as changing the hardware delivering it. Energy security, in the end, came down to knowing what you had, knowing what you used, and closing the gap between the two. On the northern plains, through winters that killed half the cattle on the range, the difference between running out of light and carrying a flame to spring often came down to what fit on a ledger line: barrels, matches, and how many hours of night a town chose to buy from the dark. If you value this kind of ledger-based, document-driven reconstruction of frontier life, stories built from account books, weather records, and the practical arithmetic of survival, consider subscribing or supporting the channel. It's research-heavy work, but it keeps these quiet histories visible and these lessons accessible for anyone building, planning, or simply trying to understand how people endured when margins were thin and winters were long.